Hey everybody, welcome back to our case study Q&A series on dieting and fat loss. And today's question that I'll be answering is from Brandon in Texas. More or less his question is, if weight training while dieting is for maintaining muscle mass and you're unlikely to actually be able to gain muscle, then what's the point of trying to induce progressive overload and push it really hard during a diet when it's probably not going to make a difference anyway? Shouldn't we just do the bare minimum to maintain muscle so that we have, a more recovered body so that the diet is more effective? So great question. And I think this all comes down to your conceptual understanding of how resistance training works. So I think it is true that while we use resistance training to maintain muscle, the way that process occurs is actually by stimulating muscle growth. Okay, and the best way to think of this is by signals. All right, so if we get a signal strength and it's like this high from resistance training to build muscle mass, but we also get a catabolic signal from our time spent when we're not eating enough food to support that, then it's really just comparing signal strengths, right? So we're trying to be in a surplus, and that's this. When we're dieting, this happens. So we're just getting less of a strong signal. And it is possible to gain muscle mass in a calorie deficit if certain criteria are met. If someone is very high in body fat, that means that they're going to have plenty of excess calories on their body to liberate to replace that deficit, so that it is easier to then use their ingested calories and the protein you're consuming and your surplus from food to build muscle. Likewise, if you're a novice and you have very few muscular adaptations to training, and those adaptations occur very easily because progressive overload has such a low threshold to occur, then you're going to see muscle growth despite being in a calorie deficit. Also, if the calorie deficit isn't too severe, that can also mean that you can put on muscle, albeit at a lower pace. So weight training in and of itself is both a anabolic and catabolic signal. If you think about it, anytime you're doing muscular work, there's going to be damage to tissue and a little bit of muscle breakdown. But of course, it's also giving you the stimulus for muscle to then rebuild and build itself even larger and stronger over time. And just because you're dieting doesn't necessarily change that mechanism. Okay. So another useful way to think about it is that while yes, dieting reduces your ability to recover, the principles for gaining muscle are the same whether you're in a surplus or deficit. The way you should train for hypertrophy is the way you should train for hypertrophy, regardless of whether you're in a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit. It's not as though the way weight training works is different when you're eating more food than you need to maintain weight versus eating less. In both cases, it works exactly the same way in your body. Right? And we also know that there's a relationship between hypertrophy in response to resistance training and the volume of resistance training. But like anything in the body and all signals, it is a parabola. So it's like this. So that means as volume goes up, your rate of hypertrophy increases. And at a certain point, as you keep increasing volume, performance and muscle mass plateaus because you're struggling to recover from it. And then eventually, if you keep increasing it, the rate of progress will go down. And then if you keep going, you'll actually get smaller and weaker from trying to do more. I mean, that's like an astronomical level of volume. Because you can only have a benefit from exercise training volume if you can recover from it. And a useful way to think of dieting is that your recovery capacity is simply less. So you should train differently while you're in a deficit, but more so in fatigue management and in how you ensure that you recover from training versus are you pushing to progress. Because progressive overload is the reason why we're actually getting a stimulus for new muscle to be synthesized. And we're in a constant state. It's not as though we build muscle and then we leave and we come back and we build it more every time we train. Our body is in a constant state of flux. Right? Muscles being broken down, muscles being built, and it's the net change over time that results in muscle growth. It's not like, a job site where you start to build a wall and the next day you come back and you start building the wall again after you clock in with your construction company. No, it's like that wall is constantly doing this, and eventually it's going to get higher, hopefully. It might get a little lower while you diet, and the effectiveness of your weight training is what's helping it go up. Okay? So, what should you do differently with your training when you're dieting? You probably want to have regularly scheduled deloads. I would probably advise somewhere between every 3 to 6 weeks, making sure that you actually take a light week. And then when you're not doing that, you should be pushing to actually progress. Your total volume might be a little less compared to when you're in the off season. So, for example, let's say if 10 is the level of volume that you do at the peak of your off season, say the first 2 months of your diet, you might be at 9, next 2 months 8, and the final two months 7, if needed. So that, basically you're still doing a fair amount of volume, but it's a little more than 2/3, even at the deepest, darkest part of your prep, compared to what you were doing. And you're still trying to progress. Even if it stops eventually being able to happen, you're still trying. And when you get to a certain point in your diet when it's just completely not going to happen, it's very useful to use things like RPE. How many repetitions in reserve do you have at the end of a set? And instead of focusing on, say, just a percentage of 1RM or a previous load you were able to do when you maybe weighed 20 pounds more, just saying, okay, I'm going to train for the same number of target repetitions, but I'm going to try to fall between, say, a 7 to 9 RPE, just so you're training as hard as you can in that moment. Because if you were to just try to do the bare minimum, you would most likely actually lose a little more muscle than if you were doing an appropriate level of volume and an appropriate stimulus for how much you could recover. So should you do less? Probably, as needed, but it should probably still be the most you can do given your ability to recover from it. That's not the most you possibly can do. Obviously, you could always do another set. It's just how much can I do and recover from it? Because the way to think of volume of training is that it's beneficial until I can't recover from it, and then additional volume is not helpful, and eventually it's counterproductive, like I said. Okay? So hopefully that helps you understand it. Thank you for your question, Brandon, and I hope this helps you retain more muscle in your fat loss journeys in the future, and I'll see you next time.